Hello guys, Colin here. When it comes to mechanical reverb units for guitar, spring is king. Long before digital emulations were commonplace, spring reverbs found their home inside many guitar amplifiers. Now, with digital effects, an amplifier can be fitted with a black box which can produce an array of convincing room and hall reverbs, but perhaps still the trickiest to nail down in the digital domain is spring. It's complex, nuanced, and to be convincingly spring requires the real thing. Anasounds' newest products aim to bring real physical springs back into the hands of players, with a pedal control surface named Element and a choice of 3 different sizes of spring tank, which can be mounted remotely or atop or beneath many standard pedalboards. Element and her trio of spring tanks go further than just catering for the vintage spring sound and offer functionality to kill the dry signal for a reverb-only sound and a switch to oversaturate the springs, driving the reverb into wild distortion. Before we get into how a spring reverb works and why you might want something like this taking up room in your rig, you might be wondering what it sounds like. If you are unfamiliar with the spring reverb sound, then here's a sample. You'll likely have heard a lot more of it than you realise. As you can see, spring reverb is a real mechanical system. Being compact and lightweight made these an incredibly popular feature of many now vintage amplifiers, and as a result, part of the most desired classic guitar tones. Let's focus on the spring tank to start with. It's a metal enclosure which houses a number of springs held under tension with a transducer at either end. When an audio signal enters the spring tank, it first reaches the input transducer, a coil of copper wire. Current flow in the coil induces a magnetic flux, an ever-changing magnetic field which influences the movement of small internal magnets connected to the springs. The transducer has converted the fluctuating voltage of the audio signal into physical movement of the spring. Compression shock waves travel the length of the spring and bounce back, continuing onwards until they dissipate all of their energy. The stronger the initial signal, the more the movement of the spring. The transducer at the output side converts the physical movement back into an electric signal, sending it back to the control surface and then onwards to the amplifier. Passing through the undulating spring produces a reverb effect, which is then blended with the dry signal. The reverb has a unique sound determined by the physical properties of the spring. That's why we don't have just one spring, but 3 of different physical properties. The movement in each spring will be slightly different for the same signal, producing a multi-dimensional reverb sound which better represents a physical space. Spring reverbs have many properties which make them useful. They are by nature duct reverbs. The spring moves less when there's a constant flurry of notes in the signal, but can move far more for short notes followed by silence. This means you can set the reverb high and it won't drown your signal while you are playing, but suddenly stop and the full wash of the reverb flows in. Spring reverbs are also wonderfully touch sensitive, in 2 meanings. Firstly, they react well to the changes in dynamics of your playing. Pick lightly and the springs move less, so the reverb is less prominent, but pick harder and the springs can move more, giving more of a reverb effect. The second meaning is more literal. If you physically smack a spring tank, you'll cause wild jostling of the springs, which produces some interesting sounds. Now that's enough of the basics of spring reverb. Let's get into the details of the Anasounds Element and why this is a great choice for your pedal board. The first huge design advantage here is that Anasounds have chosen to keep the spring tanks remote from the pedal control surface. Had they opted to put the tank and control surface in the same enclosure, they'd have firstly ended up with a much bigger pedal, and secondly, they'd have had to compromise the tank. By keeping the spring tank separate, you can mount Element to your pedal board and it won't take up any more room than a standard sized pedal. The two smaller spring tanks can be mounted to the underside of many pedal boards should you want to keep them out of sight, yet close to hand. Or rather, foot. Silicone bushings are included to shock mount the spring tanks from stage floor vibrations. But you can also mount them near your amp, or anywhere else for that matter, with a long enough 3.5mm to twin RCA audio cable, which might be advantageous if you want to keep them away from the thundering of stamping feet. It also means that Anasounds weren't limited to the size of tank they had to cram into a single commercially viable enclosure. This is perfectly illustrated by them offering 3 different tanks, small, medium and large sizes for different sounds. Named after the French for the good, the bad and the ugly, these tanks cover massive sonic ground, from the cavernous reverberations of Le Truand with its notable long pre-delay, to the all-round vintage room-sized wash of La Brute, which is my favourite, to the short bounce back and uniquely modern character of Le Bon, a tiny box perfect as a plaything for anyone into ambient music and effect soundscaping. Element itself is the control surface for the spring tanks, allowing you to engage or bypass the reverb effect with the soft foot switch. Mix blends the wet and dry signals. At minimum, you've got 100% dry and 0% reverb, but turn it to maximum and you've got 0% dry and 100% reverb. Really cool for getting those reverb-only sounds, but you can blend it to any reasonable level between these two extremes. Out dictates the output level for the reverb. Low settings keep the reverb subtle, but crank it up and the reverb will overtake the signal for huge, washy sounds. low and high are active 2-band EQ controls that affect the reverb. This allows you to fine-tune the sound of the spring to be brighter or darker to taste. The middle switch is for spring saturation. In the up position, the springs act normally, giving the expected vintage spring reverb sound. But flick it down and the output level to the springs doubles, driving them into saturation. This produces an overdriven, slightly unpredictable reverb sound, which is a lot of fun to play around with. I am thoroughly impressed with Element as a spring reverb solution. Connecting La Brute or La Truand is instant vintage spring heaven with incredible control of where it sits in the mix. The medium-sized tank is what I think most users will settle on. This gives you a great spring sound without being too massive. You can get all your medium to fairly large reverb sounds from this, and it's still compact enough that you won't have any trouble fitting it under your pedal train next to your power supply. The largest tank gives you more if you want massive reverb sounds, but the physical size of the thing does mean that you will have to find a dedicated place to put it. It's sort of the overkill solution included with a because we can attitude, and really I'm on board with that. Go big or go home, as they say, and you won't find this size of tank anywhere else except inside a large amp, so it's kind of special as a pedalboard solution. Le Bon, the smallest of the spring tanks, is a strange duck. It's spring reverb for sure, but it sounds unlike the classic vintage units that we're used to. The short bounce back has a very modern, trashy vibe to it, which suits it far better to ambient styles or even for synth users. Driving this in saturation mode gives some very interesting results, and pairing it with a long repeating delay, some modulation, maybe even some pitch shifting too, you can create some crazy soundscaping washes unlike anything you've ever heard. If you're the kind of player who likes to twiddle with the time knob on their analog delay to get those self-oscillating spaceship sounds, you're gonna love how easy it is to smack this to get the springs to go ba-doing ba-doing. It's a really cool effect. I'd love to see what someone like Stefan from the Pedal Zone could do with one of these. There's certainly a lot of creative options available here that I'm just not talented enough to tap into. I will certainly credit this tank as the most fun to play around with if you're wanting to get some interesting sounds rather than authentic vintage tones. Hopefully that has given you some better insight into spring reverb and how it operates, as well as some specifics into these beautiful new Anasounds products. Links to these products will be in the description should you want to check them out further or buy them for yourself. And if you've liked this video and you want to see more content from me, then you can hit that subscribe button, which will notify you of all new content as it comes out. My Patreon's also there for exclusive secret stuff. T-shirts are also available in other videos you might not have seen. But that's all for now, guys. Keep it loud, and I'll see you later. Doing.